Hi, and welcome to another edition of Kenduck's Classroom. I am Mr. Kenduck, and today what my plan is to discuss the emergence of political parties in the United States of America under President Washington in the 1790s. So Washington is the first president, and there were not official political parties when Washington took office. There were small groups of politicians, people in government, who maybe rallied together to support one particular issue, but there were no kind of formal parties. But by the end of Washington's term, there would be formal parties. And the two parties kind of stem from two very important, very famous men in American history. One is Alexander Hamilton, and the other is Thomas Jefferson. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline the differences between the first two political parties, kind of using this idea, this concept of Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson. Both men were very much trusted by President Washington, as Washington had hired them to be his advisors. Washington had four men in his original cabinet, and Alexander Hamilton served as the Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson served as the Secretary of State under President Washington. And Washington has deep connections with both men. For example, Jefferson was from Virginia and was from the same type of elite class, first families of Virginia type of thing. And Alexander Hamilton as well had deep connections to Washington, as Hamilton was Washington's aide-de-camp, or his assistant during the Revolutionary War. So Washington trusts both men, and he looks to both men for opinions on how the government should be run and what type of laws should be passed. And so what ends up happening is a big competition and rivalry between Hamilton and Jefferson. And many times it does kind of seem that Washington chooses Hamilton's side in some of the debates in regards to the philosophy of how the government should be run. But Washington respects both men. So what I want to do is I want to start off by talking about the differences between each men. And I basically have 3 or 4 categories where I'll be comparing the first two political parties using this Hamilton and Jefferson idea. So first off, I want to talk about the philosophy of government. So by philosophy of government, I kind of mean, what role should the government play? Who should have more power, the national government or the different state governments? Of course, according to the Constitution, they both share power, but who would have more? And so when it comes to the government philosophy, Alexander Hamilton and his followers, we'll call them the Federalists, they support the federal government or the national government having more power than the state governments, especially in regards to lawmaking. And that's not really that big of a surprise, because Alexander Hamilton did have a lot of connections to the British government, where the national government, Parliament, did have quite a big amount of power when it came to forming laws. Now, Thomas Jefferson and his followers, we'll call his political party the Democratic Republicans. Sometimes you might see them as the Anti-Federalists, but I'll refer to Jefferson's party as the Democratic Republicans. They believe that the different state governments should actually have more power than the national government, as that was the reason why we revolted against Britain in the first place, was because we thought the British national government had too much lawmaking power. So that's one of the key differences. Hamilton and his followers, the Federalists, believe national government should have more power, while the people who follow Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, they think the states should have more power than the national government. Okay, next up, I want to talk about the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, the document that gives shape and form and structure to the new government in the 1790s. And the way it works with Hamilton and the Federalists, they believe in what's called a loose interpretation of the Constitution, meaning they think that the Constitution doesn't necessarily have to be followed word for word. If the national government needs to make some type of a law, even if the national government seems like it's grabbing power from the state governments, well, that's okay. And usually what the Federalists look to is a part of the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, where it talks about the so-called elastic clause, or the quote, necessary and proper clause. And basically what the Federalists believe is that anytime the national government needs to make a law that's necessary and proper for the government to work the right way, well then it's fine. It's not a problem. The national government can go ahead and make that law. And the evidence is the national bank that was passed in Washington's term and the national debt, which was also passed in Washington's term. They're not The Constitution doesn't actually say that Congress can create a national bank or that Congress can create a national debt. But that's what the necessary and proper clause is all about. Congress can make any law that helps the government run smoothly. Now, that's the Hamilton view. The Jefferson view is totally different. In the Jefferson kind of view of government and the interpretation of the Constitution, they believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So the Democratic Republicans believe that the only law that the national government can ever make is a law that is actually able to be made based on reading the Constitution. So the Jeffersonian people, the Democratic Republicans, they take the Constitution word for word. And if there's no words about creating a national bank or creating a national debt, for example, well then they believe that those things, if they're going to be created by law, should be created by the state governments. And so it makes sense Jefferson and his followers are against the national bank and they're against the national debt because they think it's against the law, that the Constitution doesn't give power to Congress and the President to do those things. Now, some other differences between the first two political parties. When it comes to the economy and jobs and commerce and trade, the Hamilton followers, the Federalists, they believe that the most important part of economy is the growth of manufacturing. The United States was starting to make things, and Hamilton believed that this was the future of the economy, and the best kind of business that anyone could ever go into is manufacturing and commerce. Where the Jeffersonian view or the Democratic Republican view is very, very different. They believe that the best job that any American should ever have is being a farmer, that agricultural and farming things are the backbone of this country. It always has been and it always will be. So there is this kind of economic difference between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, the final difference kind of has to do with foreign affairs, dealing with other countries. The Hamiltonians, or the Federalists, they believe that the United States should always support Great Britain, as when it comes to the economy, a large percentage of the imports and exports that the United States does is with England, and so we must nurture a very good relationship with Great Britain. The Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, they're against this. They believe that, we had this alliance with the French in the Revolutionary War and they helped us, and that we should really favor the French when it comes to trading. And this was really a big issue because both the French and the English, when they were at war with one another, kind of harassed American merchants on the seas. And if you actually see my video on President Washington, that video goes into more detail. Another issue with this whole Federalists supporting England and the Democratic Republicans supporting France is the whole issue of the French Revolution. Hamilton and the Federalists, they are against the French Revolution. I mean, they kind of cheered it on when the Revolution first happened because, a country should fight for democracy and be able to choose their leaders. But in the early 1790s, 1792, 1793, the French Revolution actually takes a really ugly turn. when the king of France is executed, and people off of the street for speaking out against the government are kind of arrested in the morning and beheaded by the guillotine by lunch. And the Federalists believe that the French Revolution is too nasty, it's too violent, it's too radical. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson and his followers, they're partial to the French Revolution. They're really excited. They're happy that the French are fighting for their new government. And you know what? If some rich nobles have to die along the way, even if it's violent, well, then that's okay. And of course, Jefferson is also kind of close to the French because during the Articles of Confederation government, Jefferson did serve as the American ambassador to France. So those are the key differences between the first two political parties that formed in the 1790s under President Washington. For a really quick recap, the Federalists believe that the national government should have more power and that the state government should have less power, while the Democrat Republicans, who follow Thomas Jefferson, believe that the state governments should actually have more power than the national government. The Federalists have a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Excuse me. The Hamiltonians have a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They believe that any law that's necessary and proper should be passed, even if it's not explicitly written in the Constitution, while the Democrat Republicans believe that you must follow the Constitution word for word. And if there's no mention of a law that could be made under the Constitution, then the states should be able to make that law. And that's actually what Article 10 is in the Bill of Rights. Finally, the Federalists support things like the bank and the national debt because of their loose interpretation, while the Jeffersonians are against the bank and the national debt because the Constitution doesn't directly call for that. In addition, the Federalists believe that trading and manufacturing and commerce are the future of the American economy, where the Democrat Republicans believe that farming should be the backbone of the United States economy like it always had been. When it comes to the rivalry between France and England, the Federalists pretty much always take England's side because of the issues with trade, while the Democrat Republicans take the side of the French. Even though the French Revolution has gotten really nasty and really violent, they're all about people fighting for their freedom. Again, thanks again for tuning in to Kenduck's Classroom, where my motto is don't get fooled again on your next social studies or history test. Please feel free to leave a comment or email me at mrkenduck@gmail.com if you have any questions or any requests for videos. Thanks a lot and have a nice evening.